For being at the meeting today to get this watershed protection planning process kicked off. And thank you to Kirsten and Ashley for providing some good background information on the issues and the thoughts and ideas and the desires to protect the local resources that are ongoing down there. And really the discussions that have been had are really the impetus behind the whole development of this watershed protection plan. So basically what I'm going to do is talk through a number of different items relative to the development of a watershed protection plan. So first, I'm going to touch on the water quality standards and some of the recent water quality assessment results. That's really what drives the development of these watershed protection plans and really provides the basis for doing this type of work. From there, I will go into just the general overview of what exactly a watershed protection plan is. Obviously, a plan is a plan, but there's a lot of things that are required to be in these watershed protection plans if you want them to be accepted by the federal agencies that also have grant monies available to help implement some of these practices later on down the line. So I'll talk through all of those items. And then lastly, we will talk about just provide an overview of the watershed itself and the bacteria sources that are out there. So you may be wondering why I'm specifically focusing in on bacteria right there, and I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, those water bodies are impaired for elevated levels of bacteria, and watershed protection plans are designed to address impaired water bodies and then also protect good water bodies as well. But that's really the primary focus of this one. But that said, watershed protection plans can encompass a number of different water quality concerns out there, such as the flood mitigation, the potential nutrient impacts, and things of that nature. So they can be quite large and quite holistic. And then from there, we'll dive more into kind of the organizational structure of developing a watershed protection plan. And we're really looking to get some feedback from y'all during the meeting today via some online polls and some forms that we have for y'all to fill out about what y'all would like to see done from an organizational perspective and what y'all would like to use to develop this plan. So we'll talk through all of that. And at any point along the way, feel free to ask questions. I would ask you to just type those into the chat feature. Claire's going to be monitoring that. And if there's one that is really timely, we'll stop and answer it at that point. Otherwise, we'll get to most of them at the end of the presentation. But I think we'll have plenty of time to answer all of the questions unless y'all are just really full of questions today or something like that. But nonetheless, we will get them all answered eventually. It may just be via email afterwards or something like that if there's a plethora of them. But hopefully I'll do a good job and explain things where y'all understand it and there won't be too many questions. So just to set the stage, this is a map that shows the focus area of the watershed protection planning effort. So the pinkish purple amoeba shaped thing there is the Petronila Creek watershed. So that purple blob covers all of the land area that actually drains into Petronila Creek. So like Kirsten said, or maybe it was Ashley, I pointed to the fact that a lot of the landscape actually feeds water into those creeks. So it's not just the creek itself that is of concern, but also the land area that contributes water to those creeks. It needs to also be thought about as well, because whatever goes on the land affects what goes on in those water bodies. And then the green shaped watershed there is the San Fernando Creek watershed. So quite a bit bigger than Petronila, but nonetheless, still a lot of land area that drains into that creek and influences that in-stream water quality. So the blue lines and red lines represent the major waterways in the watershed. There's obviously a lot of other flow paths where water does flow after a good rain event or something like that and eventually make it toward the creek. But those are the larger ones that are out there that may or may not have water in them all the time. I know that that part of the coastal bend gets pretty dry pretty quick the farther you get away from the coast. So even some of these more major waterways may just be a ditch that's dry most of the time. But following a big rain event, they will oftentimes carry a lot more water than you would expect to see coming off of such an arid landscape. The green dots, the green larger dots, are the 4 currently active monitoring stations that get used in water body assessments by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They do those water body assessments every other year, and they look at a 7-year moving window of data to evaluate the health of the streams. And basically they put together a report card of how that water quality is doing. So those are the 4 stations that we'll be keying in on for this project. There are others that are out there. The smaller green and orange dots are other stations that are active. So I know Kirsten pointed to some of those special monitoring projects that are going on out there, and that's what a lot of those stations actually are. I know in the Petronila Creek watershed, there's a big effort to evaluate the dissolved solids and chlorides and stuff like that that are present in the water body relative to some work that was done a number of years ago. And that's what a lot of those other little stations there are. And then the inactive stations are stations that have been monitored at some point in history. They may or may not have data that's useful for us for assessment purposes and evaluation purposes for the watershed protection plan, but they haven't been actively monitored in the recent past. And bacteria, it's a living organism. It changes over time. So we're not going to go back 30 years into history and say, oh man, it was really bad then. That must be the same case now, because it's certainly likely that it's not the same. So we're going to look closer to today's time at the data and use that as more of a driver for the evaluations that we do relative to the watershed protection plan. So that's generally the area. Y'all know this better than I do, but these 2 watersheds are predominantly rural. There's not what you would consider a significant urban area. There's a lot more rangeland, cropland, and pastures than anything else in those watersheds. So that's not to say that the urban areas don't have their fair share of contributions to both the bacteria contributions and then other things as well, such as the nutrients or sediment issues and things of that nature. But just from a pure perspective of area, the rural spaces take up a lot more of this watershed area. So diving a little bit deeper into the water quality side of things, and this is specifically going to look at bacteria, because like I said, the creeks are impaired for elevated bacteria. And whenever we talk about that, we're looking at E. coli for your freshwater segments. So those parts of the creek that are farther away from the coast that don't have any sort of tidal influence or anything like that. And the water quality standard for those portions is 126 colony forming units of bacteria per 100 milliliters of water. So that's about 4 ounces of water. There's supposed to be 100, on average, 126 colonies of bacteria or less in that 4 ounces of water. In those tidal waters that are partially saline, is a different organism that's used. It's Enterococcus, and it's more adapted to salt water and survives better, I guess you might say, than E. coli does. And it's been determined to be a better representative of the pathogens that are out there that you might not want to ingest if you were to go swimming or recreating in that water body that would actually make you sick. So the standard for that is 35 colonies of Enterococcus per that same 100 milliliters of water. And what those standards are there for is to actually protect human health relative to contact recreation. And both the E. coli and Enterococcus are what are known as fecal indicator bacteria. So those organisms are not necessarily the thing that we're concerned about in the water that might make people sick, but they are commonly associated with fecal contamination from warm-blooded animals. And whenever I say that, that's everything with hair, fur, or feathers. So if you stop and think about that, that's a lot of different critters that are out there on the landscape, living in the house next door, and flying over the watershed that could contribute bacteria to that watershed. But basically, the fecal matter from all of those organisms also carries known pathogens that will make you very, very sick and probably wish for death in some cases. And you definitely don't want to catch any of those things. So the challenge with measuring for each of those pathogens, though, is that they typically occur in relatively low numbers. So the cost to monitor them is exorbitant compared to monitoring for a fecal indicator bacteria such as E. coli or Enterococcus. So Texas is a great big state that's blessed with over 190,000 miles of flowing water bodies. So being able to monitor the vast majority of those waters and do a good job of doing that report card or that checkup on water quality. It takes a lot of time and effort. So we have to be good stewards of our monetary resources for monitoring. So rather than going out and monitoring for that specific pathogen like a Giardia or a Salmonella or something like that, we use these fecal indicator organisms that are a lot less expensive to evaluate. And they do a great job of estimating or approximating the relative risk to people that are actually engaged in contact recreation in those water bodies. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, these creeks are pretty small. They don't necessarily support contact recreation in all cases, and that's certainly some truth to that. But one thing about these creeks is that they do flow directly into Baffin Bay where there is known contact recreation occurring. So it makes sense that if you want to maintain that contact recreation ability in the bay, then the water that's flowing into the bay should also be evaluated and held to that same standard. Now, naturally, all water bodies are not created equal. I mean, if you think about some of the water bodies out there, they have a very, very high contact recreation usage, like your Guadalupe River or your Frio River or something like that, especially relative to maybe the upper extent of Petronila or San Fernando Creeks. But nonetheless, there's still a risk to anybody that does actually go and use those water bodies. It may be less of a risk, maybe more of a risk, but without this data collection, we just don't know. But ultimately, the goal is to try and protect our resources and be good stewards of these resources and take care of them for the next generation. All right, so a little bit of the data. This is looking back at the last 6 water body assessments that TCEQ has done to look at that 7-year moving window of data. So the blue line that's represented on both of those graphics represents the applicable water quality standard. So the top graphic is the portion of Petronila Creek that's closest to the coast. So this is the tidal section. And in that section, we use Enterococcus as the water quality standard. So you can see that all the way back to the assessment that was done in 2010, that Enterococcus average over that 7-year window has been fairly well above that water quality standard of 35. So got a couple of years that are within about 10 colonies per 100 mils of water, but several others that are a little bit farther up the hill from that. So across the board, it's above that water quality standard and not meeting the desired level of water quality there. If you look a little bit farther upstream, so farther away from the coast in the non-tidal portion of the creek, you see that over time, these bacteria concentrations have progressively gone up. And currently, the last assessment shows a pretty significant increase in that E. coli concentration over the previous year. And there's a lot of variation in E. coli over space and time. So that's one of the reasons why the state uses that 7-year moving window of time to look at the water quality and evaluate that, because you may have a very severe drought situation like we had back in 2011, 2012. That could have a significant effect on water quality. So if we looked at a very small window of time, say the last year or two, if you come out of an event like that, you may have a very different water quality situation in those couple of years than you do in a normal year. Now, I know 2020 has blown normal out of the water, and who knows what normal is going to be going forward. But with that 7-year window that we look at from a water quality perspective, it still provides a reasonable amount of time that allows things to at least kind of normalize within the assessment. So in the 2022 assessment, whenever we look at the next set of data, that number may come back down. But the point here is that over the last 3 assessments, that E. coli concentration has been above the water quality standard of 126. So whenever those assessments go above the water quality standard at a significant level, which both of these are considered significantly above the standard, it triggers their inclusion on the state's list of impaired water bodies. This is also known as the Texas Integrated Report of Surface Water Quality, or the Clean Water Act Section 303D list, among other names. But basically what it means is that the water quality in those water bodies is not meeting that standard, and that something needs to be done to kind of validate if that's actually an impairment, validate the level of use that's appropriate, or put some sort of remedial action into play that will help get that water quality back to meeting those water quality standards over time. So aside from the bacteria impairments there in the water bodies, there are also concerns for elevated amounts of chlorophyll A. I think both Ashley and Kirsten mentioned that as being a concern. And basically chlorophyll A is a measurement of plant life that's growing in the water. And obviously that's a natural thing, and plant life is good in there because it starts the basis of the food chain. And everything goes up there from there. But if you get too much, it's also a bad thing and can certainly lead to adverse issues, such as those fish kills if it gets bad enough. So there are some concerns for elevated chlorophyll A in both the water bodies. And there actually is a TMDL in place for Petronila Creek that addresses chloride, sulfate, and total dissolved solids issues. So that's already there, already been done, already been dealt with. And like I mentioned earlier, I know the Nueces River Authority does a good bit of monitoring in support of that program to evaluate those chloride levels, sulfate levels, and TDS levels in the water body. But from a watershed protection plan perspective, the things that will be addressed are primarily the bacteria, so this Enterococcus and E. coli, and then also the other water quality concerns or concerns in general. So not just the nutrients in chlorophyll A, but also potentially the flooding or anything else that y'all as stakeholders bring up throughout the process. Okay, so looking at San Fernando Creek, somewhat of a similar situation there. The one thing that's different about San Fernando is that back in history, it was the monitoring location was actually considered tidally influenced. And after some evidence surfaced just from the sampling crew and an evaluation of water quality was done, they deemed that it actually wasn't considered tidally influenced at that point. So you see that gap between the 2012 and 2014 assessment where the water quality standard actually changed from the Enterococcus standard of 35 to that E. coli standard of 126. Regardless of that though, both Enterococcus and E. coli concentrations were above that water quality standard. So both are considered impaired for not meeting that appropriate contact recreation standard. And same thing here in San Fernando, where you have the concern for elevated chlorophyll A and also nitrate and total phosphorus concerns as well. And again, the nutrients are tied directly back to the chlorophyll A because nutrients obviously feed plant life and drive those levels there. So both creeks are pretty much in the same boat as far as the water quality impairments and concerns. So it makes a lot of sense to address these both at the same time, especially since the watersheds adjoin each other and they flow into the common water body that is Baffin Bay. So with that, I'm going to switch gears and start talking about watershed protection plans in general.
Lucas, we have one quick water quality question for nutrients, I think more directed towards Kirsten, but maybe it might be better to address it before we move on. Okay. Asking, are there any edge of field water quality monitoring studies collecting runoff presented along these watersheds? If not, how are the nutrient loads from agricultural fields? Have they been measured or estimated? And then you said question.
I'm going to punt that to Mike Lutz, who's probably on the call, and because I'm not sure if that might be captured by their coastal management program project. Mike, are you still on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there was some previous work done by USGS where they did some edge of field sampling up in the Petronila Creek. So that I think that report is available on their website. But yeah, with our sampling up in the watershed, we're attempting to sample at a number of different locations, including associated with ag fields and other regions as well.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I know that USGS study that Mike's talking about, I think that was done in the late 90s. And I think the estuary program helped put that together, if I'm not mistaken. Ray Allen probably has more information because I've heard him reference it. And Kirsten, I see you taking your mute off, so I'll let you handle it.
Well, I don't know that actually. I was just going to say that was before my time, but we can look and see if it's in our resource library. I'll look.
So one thing to add is that the monitoring needs are one thing that will be discussed through the development of this watershed protection plan. So if there's a strong desire locally to have some of that edge of field monitoring planned for future implementation, that's certainly something that could be included in there. So we're going to get to that in a little bit. And so at this point, I'd like to move on to presentation just so we can stay somewhat on track. I tend to talk a little bit too much, so I'm going to press on, but keep those questions coming in and we will get those answered along the way. All right, so in general terms, and this is just a high-level overview of what a watershed protection plan is. These watershed protection plans are holistic documents that are built to address water quality issues in a watershed rather than along political boundaries. We all know that water plays by a different set of rules than government or politics or anything like that. So it doesn't stop at the county line. It actually flows right on across them, and it follows the hydrological divide as opposed to those government boundaries and things like that. So really this process is built to join all of the parties within those watersheds and that have concerns in those watersheds to address the impairments in that watershed. And it's not just a singular impairment that gets addressed, it's multiple impairments, other concerns and things like that. But the watershed protection plans, they provide a voluntary mechanism to address these complex water quality issues. Oftentimes, regulatory action is taken for some things, whether it be like through permit enforcement or something like that. But if you think about the large volume of landscape that's out there, most of that is not under any sort of regulation from an entity such as TCEQ or EPA. So there's not really any regulatory action that could be taken. So these watershed protection plans provide a framework for basically an approach to address these things through voluntary mechanisms and be done through incentives rather than corrections, if you want to look at it that way. And really one of the other aspects of these watershed protection plans is to coordinate efforts. And really that's what we're trying to do with this, is to capitalize on that momentum that has been generated from the Baffin Bay stakeholder group and all of the projects that Kirsten talked about, and then also the work that Ashley and Morgan are doing on that early phase watershed protection planning. So all of these efforts are moving in the same direction. And really the goal of this watershed protection plan is to just get all of the things written down on paper and crafted into a logical plan that is all moving towards improving water quality across the watershed and within the water bodies in Baffin Bay. But to do that, we have to integrate the various activities that are occurring from around the watershed, because there's no silver bullet out there. I wish there was. My job would be much easier if it existed, but I haven't found it yet. So what we have to do is we have to actually look at things from our own personal perspective and think about, all right, what can I do as a homeowner in town, as a landowner that manages 20 acres or that manages 20,000 acres? What are the things that I can physically do that are both make sense for me economically and also have some environmental benefits perhaps? So that's really the goal, is to try to meld all these components together to come up with a plan that's reasonable for most everybody in the watershed and also gets towards achieving those water quality goals. So the Environmental Protection Agency actually has published some guidance on what they consider to be an effective approach to developing watershed protection plans. And they have included these 9 key elements of successful watershed protection plans. And basically this is kind of our guidebook for what needs to go into these documents, because whenever the state agencies and EPA review a watershed protection plan, they're going to be looking for all this information. So the plans are basically divided into chapters that address each of these 9 key points. They're not always that clear, but generally speaking, that's the way it goes. So obviously we've got to identify the causes and sources that are leading to these water quality impairments, because if we don't know what's causing the problem, how are we going to hope to fix it? So that's really priority number 1, is identifying those causes and sources. From there, we need to estimate how much of a pollutant load reduction we need to meet our water quality goals. So there's some math that involves or gets involved there, and it's somewhat daunting to look at sometimes, but it's actually not terribly complex. And we'll dive into that in future meetings. But we also need to think about what kind of management we can enact or recommend to actually address these pollutant loads and basically prevent that pollutant from entering the water body, period. So that's really the goal, is to keep a lot of these pollutants on the landscape as opposed to letting them flow over the land during a big rain event and into the water body. There's no hope for us to ever prevent all contaminants, whether it be bacteria or nutrient or sediment or whatever, from flowing into a water body. That's not the way nature works. I mean, natural systems are built to flush themselves, but there are things that we can do to minimize the effects of those flooding events, of those rain events that generate that runoff. So that's where the management measures come in. There's also some education and outreach that goes along with a lot of these things, because in a lot of cases, many of these practices are already being done out there. But a lot of folks just don't know about them, and they don't know that a lot of assistance programs exist for implementing practices and things of that nature. So that's where the education and outreach comes in. And then the next aspect is to develop a schedule of implementation and define some measurable milestones. So with any good plan, you're supposed to kind of have some targets to shoot at down the line. And that's really what that schedule for implementation is. It's built to basically put some timelines on, okay, we want to do X by this certain time and we want to do Y by this other time. And then those measurable milestones are, okay, how much of X? So if we say we want to replace 1,000 septic systems over the course of implementation, we obviously can't do all 1,000 of them in the first year. We're going to have to get resources lined up, get people interested in having a septic system replaced perhaps, and actually get our ducks in a row, so to speak, before we can start doing those things. So we may have a target of replacing 20 septic systems in the first 2 years of implementation, and then having 100 replaced by year 4 or something like that. But that's all stuff that we'll talk about over the development of the plan. And then the last 3 items are I guess that 7th item on the list there is the sources of financial assistance and estimates of costs. So this is always a big one, and it's always tough, especially with the way prices on things change over time. I mean, who would have known what lumber prices were going to do in the last year? I mean, they're basically double what they were this time last year, if not more. So it's very hard to estimate what the real costs are going to be. So we do our best to come up with an estimate for costs, but we also identify various potential sources of financial assistance to help pay for some of these things. So the last 2 items are basically tools for us to check in and see how implementation is going. So we have some basically metrics to evaluate successful implementation and see how we're doing relative to achieving those water quality goals and measuring those reductions that we've got. So obviously to do a lot of that, you need to monitor that water quality. So there are those numeric targets that say, okay, we want to achieve this much by this amount of time, but we also have those water quality targets as well. And that's where the monitoring component really comes in, is making sure that there is sufficient monitoring ongoing to be able to evaluate those water quality changes and see, okay, is this plan actually working? Is it actually improving water quality? And that also informs the decision to maybe go back to the drawing board at some point down the line. If we realize that, okay, hey, these things are not necessarily doing what we thought, there might be a need to reconvene and talk through some of the management recommendations again. The one point to make about the effectiveness and the changes in water quality is that there should not be an expectation from anyone that water quality is just going to instantly improve. The water quality in the watershed and in the water bodies have gotten to the point that they are over a long period of time. And it's going to take a long period of time to correct a lot of those issues. Now, if there was a major pollutant source that was identified along the way that was having a direct impact on in-stream water quality, that might be an option or an opportunity to have a significant change in water quality over time. But if it's truly those non-point source issues that come from the landscape that we've been talking about, that's not going to result in an immediate change in water quality. So that's the long game, where it may be 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the road before we really see a huge impact on that in-stream water quality or even the health of the bay. But that is not to say that we can't and shouldn't do what we can now and press on towards doing what we can to protect those resources and be as good of a steward to the watershed as we possibly can. So this little graphic just kind of summarizes the watershed protection planning process, and really we're going to focus on those first 4 blocks there. So building the partnerships, and really the bulk of that's already done with the Baffin Bay stakeholder group and the work that Ashley and Morgan are doing. A lot of those connections are already there. There's just a last few, connections that need to be made before we can really start this process in earnest. And the next is to characterize the watershed. So that's actually been kind of going on behind the scenes. So with a lot of the projects that Kirsten pointed to, data collection and information gathering that's gone on over time has already done a lot of that. And we've been kind of coalescing that information in preparation for today's meeting and the project in general. So those first 2 items are well on their way. The last 2 are really where the plan development starts to take shape. So after today's meeting, our goal is to start some focused discussions on respective topics and to start setting those goals and identifying those solutions to correct the water quality issues that are being discussed here. And then from those discussions we'll take and we'll actually start putting words on paper, putting numbers on paper and things of that nature to form a watershed protection plan by the end of the program. So that's the focus of this project, and that's what we're going to kind of talk through for the rest of the day today. So you may be thinking to yourself, all right, so I've never heard of a watershed protection plan. Is this something new that's being forced upon us here in Petronila and San Fernando Creek watersheds and not happening anywhere else? I can attest that that is not the case. I didn't count all of these, but there's about 30 to 40 watershed protection plans that have been developed across the state of Texas or are actively being developed. And I know the 3 that are highlighted there, the Navasota River, Arroyo Colorado, Atwac Bayou, are 3 that I've been directly involved in. And I've actually been involved in a number of others across the state. So I guess I started working on my first watershed plan back in 2007, right after I started working for the Water Resources Institute. So point being is that these things are happening all over the place, and they're recognized as a good tool in the toolbox to help address water quality issues. Again, they're not the silver bullet, but they do provide some opportunities for funding assistance and provide some benefits that aren't realized without those plans in place. And we'll talk about that here on this slide, actually. So the watershed protection plan benefits are really that they kind of help prioritize implementation areas within a watershed. You know, obviously in a watershed of this size, you need to try to get the best bang for your buck where you can, because we can't implement everything all at once. I mean, the watershed itself is well over 1 million acres. So there's obviously not going to be enough resources to implement all the things all at once. So the goal is to really prioritize those areas and identify those projects or practices that we can utilize and hope to get the most return on investment from. And really that's the goal, is to be good stewards of the resources that get brought to bear. And really the hope is that we can leverage resources at the local level, whether it be individuals that are already doing things, maybe your local governments, your regional authorities, and turn that into some funding assistance from state and federal agencies. So that's one of the benefits of these plans, is that it actually helps do that. So for instance, if you are an ag producer that goes into your local NRCS office and applies for some EQIP funding, and if you operate in a watershed that has an accepted watershed protection plan on it, you get a few preference points on your application for that EQIP funding. So it's not a guarantee, but it actually helps you rank out a little bit better in that application process. So that's just one example of a benefit. And in many cases, these watershed plans also provide some incentive, or it improves the ability to acquire grant and loan dollars for various projects that need some action. And then it also allows you to adjust over time. So these plans are not just a once and done type deal. And that's not to say that we're going to be back in 3 years redoing the plan or anything. But if along the way it's observed that, hey, this one part of this plan is just not working and we need to scrap that and kind of go back to the drawing board, these plans include an adaptive management process that allows us to learn as we go. And then the ultimate benefit and one of the strong selling points of these plans is that they are voluntary. So these plans are built to address non-point source pollution issues, and by nature, non-point sources occur all over the place, and they're not regulated by any entity or anything like that. So it truly is up to the individual out there on the landscape to be that good steward of the resource and do what they can to make it better tomorrow than they found it today, or something of that nature. So for Petronila and San Fernando Creek, really what we're going to do with this effort is to primarily address that E. coli and Enterococcus impairments that are out there. Those are the listed impairments that have really kind of spurred this process on. But there's also an opportunity to address the other issues, such as the chlorophyll A and the nutrients, and even the flooding that was mentioned earlier, or flood control or flood management rather, as well. So that's really the overarching goal, is to do that. Then we will also look at coming up with developing the locally desired and locally palatable solutions to address these issues. So you can have the best plan in the world, but if it's one of those that is not bought into at the local level, that plan is just going to sit on a shelf and not be implemented. So it's much more, I guess, appropriate or wise to actually talk to everybody there locally, find out, hey, what do y'all think is going to work? Because to be honest, the folks that live in the watershed and operate in the watershed on a daily basis know it way better than anybody from outside. I'm in College Station. I have been through the watershed a number of times, stayed there a couple of times, and all that, but I don't pretend to know anything near close to as much as y'all do. So I need y'all's help in developing this thing and telling me what's going to work, what's not going to work, and what y'all would be willing to even attempt in many cases. So that's the beauty of these things, is that it's not a top-down thing where the project team is going to come in and say, okay, y'all need to do X, Y, and Z, and that'll solve your problem. It's quite the opposite, where we may provide some suggestions or some recommendations or some examples of what has worked in other watersheds that are similar in nature, but it's going to be up to everybody that's engaged in the process locally to really describe those management measures and talk about what needs to be included in the plan. So really the main drive behind this whole project and this whole process to develop the watershed plan came out of the Baffin Bay stakeholder group and the overarching desire to protect Baffin Bay as the resource that it is. Obviously, Baffin is on the receiving end of the flow from Petronila, San Fernando, and Los Olmos Creek. And you may be wondering why we didn't include Los Olmos in this effort. And to be honest, it's because there's a lack of data that's been collected on that creek. So these plans require a good bit of information to go into them to be able to evaluate that water quality and say, okay, here's where we are today. This is where we need to get to 5 years from now. And we just didn't have the information on Los Olmos to be able to do that. So that could be a possibility down the line. But at this point, it'll just focus on San Fernando and Petronila Creeks. And really, we also want to capitalize on the existing work that's going on down there. There's a huge amount of effort and concern and activity that's already going on locally, and groups like Kirsten's with CBEP and Ashley and Morgan there at Sea Grant and Mike at Ada and Corpus Christi are doing a fantastic job of working to basically just do a better job of being good stewards of those resources and doing what we can to protect those from future generations, or for future generations, not from. So anyways, that's the goal, is to just capitalize on all those efforts and bring a plan together that basically documents these things and puts them all to bear and maps out a clear path forward on what some good priorities are. So the project team that's been developed to basically facilitate this watershed protection plan consists of these entities. So and I don't even think I introduced myself, so my apologies there. But my name is Lucas Gregory. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Texas Water Resources Institute, and we're the lead on the effort, basically. So we'll be the ones that are doing all the writing and meeting facilitation and things like that. So we're really, I guess, steering the ship, but that doesn't mean that we're doing everything, because by no means could we do it all. And that's why we brought in the local partners that are already active in the watershed, already have these relationships, and already have boots on the ground down there to assist, because we're not based in the watershed. We don't know what's going on down there near as much as everybody locally. So we decided, hey, we certainly need some assistance, and we would have been ignorant to not capitalize on the work that everybody else is already doing. So we've got Sea Grant involved, which is Ashley Morgan. They're going to continue on with the stakeholder engagement work that they've already been doing and assist with the watershed protection plan. Nueces River Authority is actually doing some additional water quality monitoring in support of the watershed plan. They'll also continue to do stakeholder engagement and data management like they have done in years past. The Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at A&M Corpus Christi, which is Dr. Mike Wetz, they're also going to be engaged with the data assessments and needed reduction estimates and watershed protection plan development and things of that nature, as is the Coastal Bend Basin Estuaries Program. And then the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board provided the project funding to support all of this, and they will certainly help out the stakeholder engagement as well, given their direct ties to the local soil and water conservation district. So that's the project team in a nutshell, and the respective roles and responsibilities. All right, so switching gears a little bit, but I'll pause for a key question or anything. Claire, do we have any burning questions that came in?
We do not have any questions that came through on the chat.
Okay, well, I'll keep talking then. So now I'm going to touch on the watershed characterization component of this just a little bit, and kind of highlight the common sources of bacteria. And again, I'm just going to focus on the bacteria in this discussion simply because those are the listed impairments for the water body. And we won't get into the nutrients or anything like that at this point. But the bacteria estimations are a bit precarious. A lot of times we have to literally get out there and do some good faith estimates to come up with some numbers that are out there. So a lot of these are based on populations for various creatures. And like I mentioned earlier, this is everything with hair, fur, and feathers that we're talking about. So if it's a human related source, that's relatively easy. We do a census every 10 years here in the United States, which the 2020 census hasn't been released quite yet. So our luck, it'll be released about a month before we're ready to roll out the plan, and then we'll feel the need to update numbers and have to go back to the drawing board, but hopefully not. But anyways, we have that census to look back at. And we kind of have that same type of information for some of our livestock. The National Ag Statistics Survey does a census of agriculture every 5 years. But for those other critters that are out there, we don't really have a good data set that we can go and look at. So we have to actually estimate these things. And for the wild creatures and even the livestock, a lot of these estimates are tied to the land cover and land use that's going on out there. So obviously we're not going to consider a cattle herd to be plopped down in the middle of Kingsville. There may be a few show animals or something like that within the city limits, but that's not going to be primary habitat for those livestock. So we try to tie these estimates to the appropriate land uses. And again, this is a space where we will be able to use feedback from everybody locally to help refine these estimates over time. And really the goal in doing these estimates is to help identify those priority areas within the watershed where that type of management practice or management practices that are designed to address E. coli loadings from those respective sources should be suggested. And basically it's just another tool to help us plan out what to do down the road. So for the purposes of the plan, we are looking to include estimates for deer or white-tailed deer, dogs and cats, feral hogs, and then your various livestock. So cattle, goats, hogs, horses, and sheep are the ones that are most common in the watershed. There may be a few others out there that are maybe some more obscure species perhaps, but that's certainly something that's open for discussion as well. And then septic systems. Septic systems are definitely a human-related source, but there's not a great consistent data set across the state that we can look at to get a good count on things. So we end up having to estimate those septic systems. So one of the things that we'd like you to provide feedback on in the form that we'll be sending out in the chat is whether or not there are other populations that we need to do estimates for. And I realize there's a whole lot of wildlife that we've missed there on that list, but the data in most cases is just not there to support good estimates for like possums or raccoons or things like that. There may be a few other species that we could get some data sets on to evaluate, but at the end of the day, wildlife are a species or a group of species that are relatively difficult to prescribe management measures for. Wildlife are not like livestock where they can be managed with a fence or anything like that. Raccoons are going to do what raccoons are going to do regardless. So there's just not a whole lot we can do about those guys. So we don't get too bothered by not being able to estimate populations for all of the pertinent species on the wildlife side of things. But those that we can manage, such as the dogs and cats and feral hogs and even white-tailed deer in some cases, and the livestock are obviously those primary species that we like to get a decent estimate of the size of population on. But please do provide that information in the chat or the forum about other sources that we can be looking at or should evaluate for the plan itself. So I mentioned land cover and land use as being a driving factor in a lot of these populations. And this map shows the relative land covers that are out there in the watershed. And this is all data that's collected by I think it's NASA that runs the satellite that collects the data, but I could be wrong on that. But basically, it's all satellite-based imagery that gets ground truth to a certain level and generated. So these are broad-based maps that may not be perfect, but it gives us a good idea of what's going on the landscape. So you can see some dominant colors out there being yellow, tan, and dark brown. That yellow is more your pastures, so your managed pastures that maybe receive fertilized periodically or herbicide treatments to control weeds or brush and things like that. Then your tan colored areas, that's more your rangeland that probably has some brush and receives a lot less management on it. And then your dark brown is your cultivated cropland. So those are by far the three dominant land uses out there, and they will certainly drive a lot of where these populations go. So for instance, if we're looking at cattle as an example, we're not going to assume that they are very prominent in the cultivated cropland. I mean, that's not the goal of those landscapes. Those cattle are going to be more on the yellows and the tans where that pasture and that rangeland is. And the same with pets. Those pets are going to be associated with people. So they're going to be primarily more in the what we call urbanized areas. So Kingsville, Alice, and San Diego, the other towns that are out there. That's where they're going to be focused. So we use the land uses to basically try and move those populations around to the appropriate location in the watershed. And again, it's not a perfect way of doing things, but given the broad scale of this approach and the broad nature of a lot of the information we have, we feel like it's a good enough assessment to base a plan on. So just from an acreage perspective, these are the respective number of acres per each land use. So you can see the big ones again are the shrub or scrub, and also known as rangeland. The pasture and hay is another big one, and then the cultivated cropland. So those three alone make up probably close to 80% of the watershed area, if not even more than that. I'm not too good at math on the fly. But nonetheless, the point being is that they're the dominant land uses, and will certainly influence where those estimated pollution sources go. So you might be thinking, all right, how are we going to estimate all this? So what we do is we look at available data that's out there, and there's local information, regional, state, national information on a lot of these different things. And then some of your councils of government have data. AgriLife Extension has information in a lot of cases, and then some of your localized agencies like Parks and Wildlife, NRCS, and even the Water Resources Institute. We may have a data set or developed a method for evaluating this. So some of the information that we use are address data. That's relative to septic systems. Obviously, if you have a septic system, you're probably in a position where you might be living at that location and you may be receiving mail there or 911 services. So you may have an address. And then the population estimates, they come in from Parks and Wildlife for your white-tailed deer, the USDA from your animals, your livestock, and USDA also publishes recommended stocking rates. So that's another way that we can kind of cross-check those livestock numbers to see if those census data are reasonably accurate. But ultimately, we need input from y'all there at the local level to tell us, hey, these numbers look way off for some reason, and there might be something that we're missing. So, and that often occurs. But again, it's that local information that helps us refine these estimates. So we definitely need y'all's opinions on these, and that's some points of discussion that we'll be having in some of the forthcoming meetings. So one approach that we use is to scale down county level data. So a lot of the data are reported by county, but in many cases, in most cases, in fact, the entire county is not in the watershed. And in the case of Petronila and San Fernando, all 4 of the counties that make up the watershed only have a portion of that county that's in there. So basically what we'll do, or what we did, is we figured out how much of the county is actually in the watershed. So you can see that Duval County, about 1/3 of the county is in the watershed. Jim Wells, 30%. Clayburgh, only about 15%. Nueces, about 20%. So if we have an estimate of 10,000 cows in Nueces County, we're going to say, okay, we can assume that only 22% of those cows fall within the Petronila and San Fernando watershed. Now, we'll obviously look at the land uses and things like that to see if that makes sense, but that's a first cut at how we scale down some of that data. So, and where this comes into play is the National Ag Statistics. So they, like I said, do a census of agriculture every 5 years. The 2017 data set was the one that was most recently published, so there ought to be one coming out again next year. And they do your common species, I guess you might say. But basically what we can do is we can use that data to come up with that locally based estimate. And it gives us a starting point, if you want to call it that. So what we did is we actually went up and we did that, and we will take a look at that right quick. So I'm going to move through these pretty quickly just because like I said earlier, I talked a bit too much and we need to press on. So basically, we just did those percentage-based estimates and estimated those numbers for the primary livestock species out there across the watershed. And again, this is just a starting point. We'll refine these in some work group discussions later on, but it gives us something to think about. So wildlife, we kind of do the same approach. Parks and Wildlife publishes a deer density data set. They do this on an annual basis, and over the last 5 years or so, the average density of deer in the watershed is about 1 deer per 39 acres. So using that, we assume that deer should be found on cropland, forest land, pastures, rangeland, and wetlands, and came up with an estimate of about 30,000 deer. Hogs are similar. We used a conservative estimate of 1 hog per 50 acres. This is always a great point of discussion in these watershed plans. And I know we've had some people, they'll comment that they'll say, oh, that should be more like 50 hogs per acre rather than 1 hog per 50 acres. But again, that's certainly a point of discussion that we'll refine over time. But this just gives us a starting point for these population estimates. So human associated with the pets, this is another one where we can use the data sets that are out there. So the American Vet Med Association did a survey about a decade ago now that pointed to an average number of dogs and cats per household. So what we do is we count the number of individual households that are reported in the census, and then just do some math and come up with some estimates. So both for dogs and cats, we're around 20,000 of each in the watershed. And I don't know, maybe this little guy here, he could be that half of a dog that is on average in each person's house or something like that. But nonetheless, it's, again, a good starting point for us. Septic Systems is done similarly. We have not finished this assessment yet. It's one of the more complex things that we do to evaluate potential septic contributions in the watershed. So we're still working on this one, but it's largely based on the number of households that are in a watershed as well. But we do take those that are served by wastewater out of play because they have send their waste to a wastewater treatment plant. So that takes a lot more verification and evaluation of data to refine that number and come up with an idea of how many septics are out there. But that's something that we're going to continue to work on over time. And we will work with those local county officials to validate those estimates and really come up with some solid numbers. And then wastewater treatment facilities, they also are contributors of E. coli and nutrients to the water systems that are out there. So this is a list of all of the permitted facilities that are out there, and the dots on a map or on the map show relatively where they are. So in theory, when these wastewater treatment plants are operating correctly, they shouldn't be contributing too much pollutant to the water bodies. But if something goes haywire, like a big flood, and they get overwhelmed with water, that could certainly not be the case. So they also get considered in these plans, and oftentimes they will serve as an individual working group or something like that. So population growth is another thing that gets considered. It takes, I mean, populations grow over time. I know just in my lifetime, the population of the state has grown immensely, and there's nothing we can do to stop that. So that's something else that we'll look at. And just some of the data from the state demographer shows that there's going to be some pretty, or anticipated to be some pretty significant increases in population over time that we'll need to evaluate as well. So really the next steps in this process are to refine those goals and come up with those source estimates that we want to use as a basis for the plan. And then basically work with the local stakeholders through more focused meetings to come up with those management recommendations to achieve those water quality goals that are there.